November 23rd, 1944. 5:30 hours. The eastern edge of the Hürtgen Forest, on the big red one's axis toward the open ground beyond the trees. The road in front of Karl Miller was not really a road anymore. Engineers had laid timber over mud until the timber sank. Tank tracks had chewed the top layer to black slime. Off that narrow strip waited mines, roots, shell holes, and cold. In that part of Germany, a man could leave the road by 3 feet and disappear from his platoon as completely as if the earth had opened under him. Karl stepped over a low concrete obstacle half buried in wet needles and looked into the trees. Cold hung over broken trunks shaved by shellfire and on the helmets of men from the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, men who had fought through one country after another and now found themselves checked by a patch of woods that seemed to know every American habit before the Americans used it. He had a German face in an American helmet. In Wisconsin it had never mattered. In England it had made sergeants laugh. In France it became something men noticed. In the Hurtgen it became a liability. Captain Morgan checked the line before dawn and stopped in front of Karl. "In this forest," he said, "German is not a skill. It's evidence. If you hesitate, the first men who'll doubt you won't be theirs." Karl adjusted the strap of the damaged field radio he was helping carry and felt the waterproof oilcloth packet under his tunic. Morgan had not seen cowardice. He had seen division. Inside the oilcloth was the last letter from Berlin. Hans's handwriting had been strong then, almost proud. That was years before. Before Europe turned into a map of hunger and uniforms that ate the men inside them. Hans had written about order, usefulness, and Germany's future. Karl had folded the letter until it was a small, hard square. He carried it not because he trusted it, but because he did not. At 05:47, the first incoming round burst in the treetops. That was the signature of the place. Elsewhere, artillery drove men into the ground. In the Hürtgen, it reached down from above. Metal and wood came together. Splinters fell like knives. Men who had learned to flatten themselves against earth in other campaigns discovered that the forest had changed the geometry of survival. The second burst caught the radio operator 3 paces behind Karl. The antenna spun away while the man folded backward into a shell scrape without a sound. The third burst was closer. Someone shouted for cover. Someone else shouted a grid reference nobody could use because the world had become branches, white flashes, and falling wood. Karl lost the rest of the squad in that violence. He lost them because a tree went down between him and the file, because mud swallowed direction, because the forest had no horizon. He rolled through wet leaves, saw the outline of a forester's hut through the bursting branches, and went for it because there was nothing else upright nearby that was not about to explode. He slammed through the door and landed on one knee in damp straw and ash. At first he thought the shape in the corner was a sack. Then it moved. A boy, 7, maybe 8, thin face, collar too big for his neck. He was holding a kitten stiffened by cold. The animal was frozen so hard it looked carved. The boy's eyes did not widen when Karl came in. They were already at their widest. Outside, the shelling rolled deeper into the woods. Instead of relief, Karl heard voices, German. Then another voice answered, and Karl went cold. Berlin. Not merely High German. Berlin, under the words, the clipped impatience he had heard at his parents' kitchen table whenever old letters were read aloud. For an instant he was no longer in a hut in a shelled forest. He was a boy again, while his mother pretended not to hear the pride in Hans's early letters. The patrol stopped outside. The latch rattled. Karl's first calculation was military. 1 carbine, partial ammunition, a frightened child, almost no cover. If the patrol entered alert, he might kill 1, perhaps 2, before the hut became a coffin. His second calculation was worse. If he survived by speaking German, he would be alive in a way both armies could mistrust. The door opened. A corporal came through first, then 2 men behind him. They looked past Karl toward the boy in the corner. Karl did not lift the carbine. He swore at the child in fluent German and stepped forward as if he had every right to be there. He called the boy a useless forestry brat left behind by panicked civilians. He snapped that the hut had already been checked, that the shelling had broken his unit apart, and that if the corporal wanted to waste time on half-frozen children while Americans were probing the tree line, he was welcome to explain it to a lieutenant who had not slept in 3 days. The corporal stared at him. Karl knew the danger was not grammar. It was tone. One wrong softness, one American edge to the consonants, one pause before the insult, and suspicion would harden. The corporal's eyes dropped to Karl's boots, shoulders, face. Mud helped. Everyone looked borrowed from somewhere else in that forest. Everyone smelled of wet wool, smoke, and bad food. The corporal jerked his chin toward the boy. "Take him to the rear if you care that much." "I care about him not screaming when the next barrage comes in," Karl said. "Get out of the door." Fatigue saved him. Fatigue and the fact that the forest was full of unfinished tasks. The corporal backed out. The others followed. Their boots receded. Karl found the last square of K-ration biscuit in his pocket and set it in the boy's lap. The boy looked at the biscuit, then at Karl, then at the kitten. He laid the frozen animal down carefully and broke off a piece no larger than a coin. That tiny movement settled the matter. Karl could have left then. Men survived battlefields by abandoning details just like this. But the boy had accepted the biscuit without noise, with the care of someone who already knew sound was expensive. If Karl walked away, he would spend the rest of his life knowing the exact face he had abandoned. He wrapped the child in an old blanket and moved. That choice kept the boy alive for the next hour. It also closed the easiest door back to the American line. Somewhere in the forest were German soldiers who had heard him speak like one of them. Somewhere behind him were Americans who had been warned not to trust him if he faltered. The line between armies had become portable. He carried it inside his chest. He worked along a drainage cut half filled with leaves and rainwater. Near a break in the ditch, he found the wounded man. The man had tried to crawl under the roots of an overturned fir and had not made it. Blood had darkened his tunic from belt line to groin. His rifle lay out of reach. His face was older than Karl remembered, and yet instantly familiar. Otto Weiss. Otto had once lived across from the Millers in Milwaukee before his family returned to Germany in the early 30s. He had punched hands in the shoulder over a baseball game and eaten supper at the Miller table that same night. Otto focused on him and gave a dry, unbelieving laugh that collapsed into pain. "Karl?" Karl looked at the boy, then at Otto, then into the trees. If Otto called out, the forest would answer with boots. Karl crouched and put a hand over Otto's mouth until the man nodded. "You're dead," Otto whispered when Karl let go. "Or you were supposed to be." "So are you," Karl said. "The one in the concrete," Otto said after a moment. "That's your brother." Karl did not answer. "Number 4 position. Machine gun section. He doesn't sleep anymore. Nobody there does." With that sentence, danger found a name. "Are you sure?" Otto looked at him with something between pity and bitterness. "I know the face." He coughed and winced. "They moved men around after Aachen. Replacements. Remnants, old fortress troops. Boys, old men. Anyone with fingers enough to load a belt. He ended up forward, right side of the lane. Mines in front, wire beyond that. If your people bring a tank, it has to use the road. If it uses the road, he sees it." Otto was not giving Karl drama. He was giving him geometry. Karl put the boy down in a culvert depression choked with brush and spoke to him in German. "Stay low. Stay until dark or until Americans came. If Americans came, say nothing until they gave him bread." The boy looked at Karl for one long second and nodded. Otto watched with the tired focus of a dying man. "You still talk like home," he said. There was no accusation in it. That made it heavier. Then Karl turned toward the trees and went forward. By late November, the Hürtgen Forest had taught every army in it the same lesson. Roads were fate. Karl moved beside a logging track rather than on it. He knew enough about mines to trust patterns more than open ground. Mud on the road was at least honest. Smooth earth off the shoulder could be anything. The Germans had seeded approaches, tied obstacles to sight lines, and used the forest not as scenery but as structure. Concrete positions sat where roads narrowed, or where fire could rake a gap between stands of fir. Wire turned men so machine guns could meet them sideways. Mortars climbed the trees and came down sharpened by wood. That was why a single machine gun position mattered here in a way it would not have mattered in open country. In the Hürtgen, a bunker could become the hinge for the whole day. Karl found proof of earlier attempts before he found the bunker. A Sherman stood off the track where blackened mud had slumped around one buried tread. Not a fresh kill. Beside it lay a coil of engineer tape torn in 3 places. Beyond that were 2 helmets half filled with water and a rifle stock sticking out of leaves. No bodies. They had either been recovered under fire or buried where they fell by the forest itself. Karl studied the ground and made the position in his head. Road, killing lane, armor forced into predictability, supporting infantry channelized, observation slit likely offset from the obvious front, rear approach probably through a fold in the terrain or a communication trench masked by brush. The language helped until it didn't. Once a private smoking under a poncho looked up and said something about soup. Karl answered with a complaint about officers and watery turnips. The private laughed and looked away. The right answer was not the words. It was the weariness. The deeper he went, the smaller the margin became. Frontline troops looked longer than rear area men. They noticed boots, mud pattern, the way equipment hung. Karl kept his shoulders rounded under fatigue he did not have to fake. He did not walk too cleanly or too carefully. The trick was not invisibility. It was belonging to the general ruin. By mid-morning he reached the rear of Position 4. It was smaller than the fear around it had made it. A low concrete structure pushed into a slope, roof camouflaged with branches already shredded by weather, front facing a lane of thinner timber and churned ground. The front slit was only half the problem. There was a secondary angle to the right, cut low and hard, covering the approach any stretcher party or supporting rifle group would use once the first men went down. Wire lay in irregular belts before the lane. Beyond the wire, Karl saw the disturbed, too neat earth of mines. Behind the bunker, a narrow trench tied it to foxholes and ammunition recesses. It was enough to stop a company. More importantly, it was enough to stop the one road the Americans needed that day. Karl found a blind pocket behind blown roots and looked through a rear observation slit no wider than a hand. Hans was inside. Recognition came before certainty. Not the face first. It was the set of the shoulders, the slight forward lean when feeding a belt, the impatience in the hands. Then the face turned enough for Karl to see the nose he knew from family pictures, the cheekbones sharpened by hunger, the hollows under the eyes. Hands had once been broad. In the bunker he looked consumed. The hands were the worst of it, raw knuckles, cracked skin, fingers moving stiffly on the belt with the concentration of a man forcing pain to wait. The letter in Karl's tunic suddenly seemed obscene. It belonged to someone who had believed in clean purpose. The man in the bunker belonged to mud and sleeplessness. Karl watched him check the gun's traverse by touch. Hans was not merely present. He was essential to the position. He knew the arc intimately. He was the man who would decide where the bullets went when the attack came. And the attack was coming. The sound reached the bunker as a shift in the forest, engines back on the lane, the clink of men moving equipment. Then American artillery began to search deeper positions, not enough to destroy the bunker, but enough to pin what supported it. American riflemen appeared between the trees in short rushes. The forest broke every assault into fragments. One squad moved left toward a fold in the ground. Another hugged the road edge behind a Sherman. The tank tried to nose off the timber to bring more of its front toward the bunker and immediately paid for it. The right tread vanished in a brown-black eruption. The hull slammed down hard enough that Karl felt it through the earth. A buried charge or a telemine set where the road tempted armor to widen. Same result. The Sherman could still fire if the crew kept their nerve. But they had lost movement, and in that forest movement was life. Hands opened up. The MG-42 did what it had been built to do. It turned uncertainty into sudden decision. Men crossing 10 yards of open ground were either cut down at once or driven so flat into the mud that the whole advance stalled around them. Karl saw one American spin backward against a stump. Another fell forward and tried to crawl. A third disappeared into wire and began thrashing with the urgency of a trapped animal. It was not the volume alone. It was the angle. Hans knew the lane. He walked fire through the places frightened men instinctively went. The low patch, the stump line, the side of the disabled tank. Karl's hand closed on the white phosphorus grenade at his belt. If he threw it through the ventilation gap behind the bunker, the fight would end quickly. White phosphorus did not ask questions about kinship. It entered cloth, skin, eyes, lungs. The concrete box would become an oven. He pulled the grenade free halfway. Then a voice behind him said, "You, turn around!" Karl froze. A young officer stood at the rear trench turn with a pistol in one hand and suspicion already complete in his eyes. "Which platoon?" the officer asked. Karl turned slowly, letting the grenade ride down his sleeve out of sight. He answered in German and named a rear security detail he had heard mentioned earlier. The officer's gaze dropped to Karl's boots. Wrong pattern of wear, American issue. Mud had concealed much, not enough. The officer lifted the pistol. Karl moved on instinct. He hit the man's wrist, drove into his chest, and both of them went down into the trench wall in wet earth and roots. The pistol fired once into dirt. Karl struck the officer's face with the radio battery case, took a knee in the man's stomach, and felt hands claw at his tunic. Something snapped loose. His dog tags came free of the chain and slid across mud to the bunker threshold. The machine gun inside stopped. Silence in battle is never pure. The Sherman still clanged. Men still shouted in the lane, but the absence of Hans's gun cut a hole in the noise so sharp Karl felt it in his teeth. He turned. Hans was in the entrance shadow, one hand still on the gun mount, the other holding the tags Karl had dropped. Rain had cleaned one edge of the metal, enough to read. Brothers do not always recognize each other by face after years and war. Sometimes they recognize the shape of being recognized. Hans looked at the tags, at Karl, and then beyond Karl toward the forest, where American soldiers were still trying to move under a bunker, he commanded. Hans did not raise his weapon toward Karl. That mercy, if it was mercy, lasted only a breath. "Karl," he said. He said it as one might say the name of a place drowned under a reservoir. Real, remembered, unusable. The officer in the trench was still moving weakly under Karl's knee. Karl shoved him aside and stood. Rain slipped down the concrete and gathered on the edge of the entrance. Hans's eyes flicked once over Karl's American webbing, the half-hidden grenade, the mud, the face he knew and did not know. "You should have stayed in America," Hans said. It was not anger. What sat in his voice instead was the fatigue of a man who had already buried too many alternatives. "Komm raus," Karl said before he could stop himself. "Come out." Hans's mouth changed by 1 degree, not a smile. Something more ruinous. "There is no out," he said. Then he turned back toward the gun. That movement ended the argument. Hans had recognized his brother and chosen the bunker anyway. Karl had been waiting for some gesture that would excuse him from what came next. Instead, Hans settled behind the MG-42 as if blood and history had merely interrupted a firing sequence. The gun came alive again. An American near the wire jerked and went still. Another man behind the disabled Sherman tried to dash toward the hull and was driven face first into the mud by rounds clipping the earth around him. A stretcher team that had begun to move from the road dropped flat before they even reached the wounded. Captain Morgan's warning returned with a clarity Karl hated. In this forest, German was evidence. So was hesitation. He looked at the phosphorus grenade in his hand, then at Hans behind the weapon. White phosphorus would solve the problem fastest. It would also make the last image of his brother one he could never outlive. Karl slid the grenade back. not because Hans deserved gentleness, simply because one line remained while another method still existed. He took the smoke grenade instead. Rounds snapped overhead as he moved right, using the bunker's dead ground and the broken rear slope. The young officer he had fought made a sound behind him and tried to reach his pistol. Karl kicked it away without looking down. There was no room left in the minute for anything except geometry. Smoke first, then radio, then guns. The damage set had been bouncing at his side since the bombardment broke the squad apart. He dropped behind a shell hole half filled with yellow water, yanked the handset free, and cranked the tuning wheel with numb fingers. Static surged. Nothing. Then fragments of English cut to ribbons by interference and terrain. "Miller," he said. Static swallowed it. He tried again, using his full name, unit, and the challenge sequence Morgan had drilled into every man likely to operate near the forward edge. The battery faltered. He slapped the casing. Somewhere above him, a shell burst in treetops, and the forest rained splinters into the smoke. A voice came back faint, suspicious, human. "Say again." He repeated it, forcing each syllable clean. He gave the prearranged word. The voice asked for the answer. He gave that too. There was a pause, just long enough to remind him what he sounded like now. A German-speaking American calling from behind a German bunker in the middle of a forest where nobody trusted what they could not see. Then Morgan himself came onto the set. "Location." Karl gave it in map squares and correction terms, using the wrecked Sherman, the lane bend, and the bunker's right-hand firing angle as reference. He did not say, "My brother is inside." Morgan asked one confirming question about the disabled tank. Karl answered. The captain believed him or had no better option. "Smoke out?" Morgan asked. "Out in 10. Stand by." Karl pulled the pin and lobbed the smoke into the depression just forward of the bunker's right side, where the wind and terrain would drag it across the slit without masking the American approach too early. The canister landed, hissed, and began to spit thick white cloud into the lane. Hans's gun shifted, chattering at shapes now partly hidden. Good. Force him to guess. The first American adjustment rounds came in short. Earth jumped left of the bunker, then behind it, then on the wire. Karl corrected once more. "Drop 50, right 20. The next concentration hit the bunker front and the slope above it. Concrete does not die elegantly. It sheds, it cracks, it spits dust, stone, wood, and steel in all directions at once. One front corner blew outward. The machine gun cut off in mid-burst under the concussion, returned for half a second, then vanished as a follow-on round struck close enough to lift the rear earth and slam it down again. American infantry moved the instant the fire shifted. Men came out of the smoke and around the wrecked Sherman in hard, low rushes. One squad hit the wire with Bangalore fragments and cutters. Another poured rifle and BAR fire into surviving foxholes tied to the bunker trench. The lane, which moments before had belonged entirely to Hans's gun, became contested ground, and then, inch by inch, American ground. Karl should have gone forward with them. Instead, he ran toward the ruin. Some debts are not patriotic. They are private, senseless, and compulsory. The bunker mouth was half blocked by broken concrete and twisted reinforcing bar. Smoke inside mixed with dust until breathing meant swallowing grit. A shattered ammunition box burned in one corner. Someone, perhaps the young officer, perhaps another crewman Karl had never seen, lay under fallen debris, with only one boot visible. Hans was alive. He was pinned from the waist down by collapsed concrete and steel. The MG-42 mount overturned beside him. Blood had dried dark around one ear and freshened again at his mouth each time he drew breath. He looked at Karl with the exhausted recognition of a man who had finally reached the cost he knew was coming. For a moment Karl thought he might try to lift the slab. He crouched and put both hands on it. It did not move. Outside, American rifle fire pushed deeper into the line. Somewhere beyond the bunker, another shell landed. The structure shifted a fraction. Dust spilled from a crack overhead. If Karl stayed and tried harder, the bunker would bury them both. Hans knew it too. He looked once at Karl's hands on the concrete, then at Karl's face, and shook his head by less than an inch. No speeches came. War had spent the family's available language long before that day. Karl's eyes went to the torn field grey collar. A single metal button still clung there through dust, blood, and smashed concrete. He took out his knife and cut it free. That small act was all the theft the moment allowed. Not identity papers, not the whole tunic, just one button. Hans watched him do it. Then Karl stood and backed out of the bunker, because staying was impossible and leaving was unforgivable, and one of those facts had to win. He emerged into a lane full of American voices, stretcher calls, smoke, and the stunned forward motion that follows the destruction of a hard point. Men passed him headed east, deeper into the trees. Nobody stopped him. He was covered in enough mud, dust, and blood that he belonged to the general appearance of success. By nightfall, Position 4 was a coordinate in a notebook, another obstacle removed at a price no battalion summary could properly state. The army would mark the day by ground gained, positions reduced, casualties counted, ammunition expended, road conditions, evacuation delays. Somewhere in those records, the fight would become military fact. Armies cannot function on private truth. Karl gave his report in fragments suitable for paperwork. He had been cut off by tree bursts. He had infiltrated forward. He had identified a concrete machine gun position controlling the lane. He had called correction fire that enabled the advance. He omitted the Berlin accent outside the hut. He omitted Otto. He omitted the dog tags in Hans's hand. He omitted the seconds in the bunker after the shells landed. The Purple Heart came later for shell fragments and timber shards sustained in the action. Men congratulated him with brief respect and no ceremony. A medal in wartime was often less a crown than a receipt. The war ended. Germany broke. Roads reopened. The Hurtgen remained in the men who had crossed it as a climate of the mind more than a battlefield. Karl remembered the doorway and the pause before Hans turned back to the gun. In 1946, he sat on the porch of his family's farm in Wisconsin with the letter from Berlin finally open on his knee. The paper had yellowed. Hans's handwriting looked younger than the hand Karl had seen feeding the belt in the bunker. The letter spoke of duty, stability, and serving a country that would make room for a man if he did his part. Reading it after the war did not feel like receiving a message from the dead. It felt like examining a fossil from a species that had not known extinction was coming. Karl read it once. Then he took the button from his pocket and the Purple Heart from its box and walked out to the old oak beyond the fence line. The ground was softer there from overnight rain. He dug until the hole was deep enough that frost would not find it quickly. He put the medal in first, then the button. American service over German cloth. A wound awarded by one army laid against the fastening from another. Not reconciliation, just burial. The simplest arrangement he could make between two loyalties that had never truly coexisted except in his body. He covered them with earth and tamped the ground flat with the back of the spade. The farm was quiet. Wind moved over corn stubble in the distance. Somewhere inside the house, dishes touched lightly in a cupboard. It looked like peace. Yet as Karl stood under the oak with dirt on his hands, he understood something he had not been able to say even to himself in uniform. The Hurtgen had not divided him between America and Germany. That would have been almost manageable. It had divided him between the man who answered to his oath and the man who still knew the sound of home in an enemy voice. Those two men had walked into the forest together. Only one had walked out with a report the army could use. The other stayed behind in a concrete ruin with a brother who had recognized him and turned back to the gun. The fog in Wisconsin was nothing like the fog in Germany. It rose softer off fields, without smoke or explosives in it. But when it gathered under the trees at dusk, Karl could never quite convince himself that he had left the forest at all.